Hello everyone, great to see you again. I am from Business Analysis Excellence and my name is Esther Lessing. Today I'm going to talk to you about contracting versus permanent employment. I'm not sure if you're currently working as a permanent employee and perhaps you're wondering what it's like to be a contractor, or perhaps you're thinking, I'm a contractor, I'd love to be part of a permanent team. So today I'll discuss the benefits and disadvantages of both of those sides of the coin. So let's get stuck in. Great. So let's have a look. Contracting or permanent employment? Welcome to this video. I look forward to sharing this topic with you. Okay guys, just a quick disclaimer. Our videos express only our views and opinions as we perceive them. And from a copyright perspective, this video cannot be used or sold as paid for training without our consent. Thank you. So let's talk about the 6 considerations that we've looked at in terms of contracting and permanent employment. Now, we'll run through these 6, but before we get into them, just quickly to be clear, a contracting role, as we describe it here, is a temporary fixed time period, like for example a 6-month period, where you get paid a daily rate by a potential customer or employer. And a permanent role is where you get formally employed by the company, you get paid annual leave, you get paid sick leave, and you are on a permanent contract with that company with no specified end date. Okay, so what we'll look at here is we'll look by starting to discuss salary, because that's often something that people think might be more attractive when you do contracting. We'll also look at your personality and what you should consider before choosing either contracting or permanent employment. Career growth, what should you consider around this? Flexibility, how to handle stress, and what experience should you have? And then once you've looked at all of these considerations, I'll give you our verdict, or perhaps my personal verdict and preference. Okay, great. Let's continue. Just a quick reminder, if you're enjoying this video so far, please subscribe or consider subscribing, or perhaps just give us a like. Thank you. So the first consideration, let's look a bit beyond salary. So what I'm going to discuss with you now is a specific example of a contract. So let's say, for example, you are offered a contract for 6 months and you've got a day rate of 850 Australian dollars per day. This is a gross payment, so no deductions has been taken off. And you also get offered a permanent role and you're thinking, should I take the contract? By looking at the salary, it might look really appealing. Or what should I really know in terms of the contract before making that final decision to say no to a permanent role instead? So let's have a look at what I've come up with here. Now, keep in mind, these are just guidelines, and this example is specifically Australian kind of considerations and Australian tax rates and so forth. But in principle, these should be the same considerations in any country where you may be considering taking a contract instead of a permanent employment. So let's look at consideration 1. Let's look beyond just the salary that we sometimes get fixated on. Here, we'll take an example, gross daily rate of $850 per day. Maximum of $221,850 per year if you worked the maximum number of working days every year. So that looks pretty good, nice healthy salary, and something that certainly needs careful consideration if you have to compare this with potentially taking a permanent role of what appears to be a lesser salary. But there are some really important things to consider when you consider taking on a day rate contract. Mandatory deductions. So here you have to look in the Australian market If you work as a company, so a PTY Limited, you will be subjected to pay 27.5% tax. Plus, you also need to pay 10% GST, which is sales tax. Now, there are certain business deductions that you can definitely deduct from your gross pay before paying tax. Things like business expenses, potentially travel or accommodation expenses if they are legitimate. Then some of the further deductions that you need to consider is third-party management fees. And here I've just put an estimate of about 0.5% to 2%, where this involves if you don't create your own PTY Limited or your own company structure, you can potentially work through a third party that manages this for you. They will then take this service fee. Now, this would be what they will do for you is they'll process your invoices, so make sure that you get paid. And they will also cover things like professional indemnity insurance and work cover, which is something that you'll need to do if you wanted to run your own company. You'll have to pay for that separately. But when you use a third party, they can do this all for that 2% service fee. Another optional and highly recommended deduction would be that you consider superannuation and putting some money aside for that. Now, in Australia, superannuation is what is almost like a pension fund that you can save towards your retirement. And it's recommended that even when you do a day contract, although it's not mandatory for you to do, that you do plan for this and you do cost it in so that you can still pay for your future and make sure that you can retire comfortably. Now, other considerations when you compare a day contract with a permanent role. When you're a contractor, you don't get annual leave, as you would know. So you need to think about, even though you might be very ambitious and you might want to work a lot of the time to maximize your income, you do have to take some time off. So in Australia, typically if you're on a permanent contract, you would get 20 days Australian annual leave. Sick leave would be approximately 10 days that you're entitled to, which you may or may not take. And then, of course, remember public holidays. Although a public holiday is something that you clearly won't get paid for. So as a contractor, if you don't work, you don't get paid. It's that simple. So consider that when you start calculating how much, or when you start comparing a permanent offer with a contract offer. So look, these are just some of the main considerations for you to think about. If you are purely looking at this from a financial perspective, make sure that you've got a realistic idea of what your contract is really going to cost you and whether it's still worth your while. It may well still be worth your while. And also keep in mind some of the other things like professional development and so forth is something that can be a deduction, but it's something you have to pay for yourself. So I think those are the main things for you to think about when you consider the financial implication of contracting versus permanent roles. But there's other considerations. Is your personality perhaps something to think about? And I certainly think it is. So let's answer a few questions, or let me ask you a few questions and you can answer it for yourself. First of all, do you believe it's easy or difficult to find a new job? This is a very important question. Some people, in their minds, it's just a belief. Perhaps they had a bad experience in the past. Perhaps something happened to them that meant that they didn't find a job very easily at some stage in their life. But that made them essentially tell themselves that it's difficult to find a new job. If you are one of those people, I would recommend you don't look at contracting, or you change that belief and you change it so that you believe it's really easy to find jobs. Another question you can ask yourself, Do you feel worried if you know your contract is ending soon? Now, some of us don't worry about that at all. We're excited about at the end of a contract. We start to look forward at what's next. And that's a general attitude. But then others have got, like I said, almost similarly to the previous question, you worry about the future. You're a bit more of a worrier about what if. And therefore, you will get worried if you have a contract that's coming to an end. So just think about how worried are you, and are those worries substantiated? Another question you can ask yourself is, do you like the idea of changing jobs frequently? So this means you get used to new people, so you need to be able to build another set of relationships, meet more people, and start from scratch, essentially. The culture will be different in the next organization. If you are on a contract and you do have to move around, and you may even move between industries, that will be different. So it's a steep learning curve. You kind of have to be quite flexible and adaptable. And is that something you like doing? Or do you prefer having a permanent, stable environment where you know everyone, you understand the culture, and you work with the culture? And then the last question is, do you value independence higher than company loyalty? And there's nothing wrong with wanting to be independent and free from working for someone else, in a sense, rather than working as a permanent employee and feeling loyal to that company. However, at the same time, some of us really like that stable environment where we can build up a great reputation and also build up our own loyalty to an organization. It all depends on what your value system is and where on your value list these different values sit. So these are important things for you to have a good think about before you make a decision about whether you want to be a permanent employee or a contractor. Now, another one is career growth. Now, this is one where you should perhaps take things with a pinch of salt that I'm going to say now. But in a general sense, you would think that when you are in a permanent employment, you may get more opportunities internally, you may get more opportunities for professional development as a permanent employee, because the company have an obligation to work with you, to retain you as a staff member, and therefore help you to build your career. This doesn't necessarily always happen, and it's important for you to keep that in mind, depending on the organization that you're looking at working for. Whereas if you're a contractor, you are still building your career, you are still growing your career, and in some ways, you have to work slightly harder to make yourself more marketable. However, it is all up to you how much professional development you do, what opportunities you take advantage of to be able to grow your career. So it's all up to you. You are certainly responsible for your own career growth. But like I said, again, it all depends on the environment that you're in as to how much you can do of this particular step. But career growth, certainly a consideration for you to think about. Now, the next one here is flexibility. This is another consideration that probably before COVID happened, we would have said, if you were a permanent employee, you would have more opportunities to potentially do flexible working arrangements, where you might work from home or where you might be able to work part-time or potentially even do 9 days a fortnight and have every second Friday off. Whatever the arrangement might be, that's what we would have said before COVID. And we would have said, okay, if you want flexibility, go for a permanent role. However, these days, now that we all are used to COVID working arrangements, so we can basically work from home all the time, we have to in some cases, and that has really opened up the world of flexible working to organizations. Companies are seeing the benefit across the board costs them less, and they've seen that people really work effectively, especially as business analysts. We can be just as productive working in a virtual environment. So I wouldn't say that flexibility, when you consider contracting versus perm, is that much of a difference anymore. But I would say that you need to look at the organization itself, regardless of the nature of the contract, to look at what your flexible options would be. Yes, and we would all, of course, love to sit on a mountain one day on our laptops. And that's the ultimate flexible working arrangement. But let's hope for at least being able to work from our couch at home. Okay, so consideration number 5. So with consideration number 5, I've labeled it here stress. Now, stress is quite relative, and in this particular context, it's about, will you feel as a contractor potentially that you have to work harder and do more than a permanent employee, or if you were in a permanent capacity with an organization? This is probably a bit of a myth, but at the same time, it could be a bit of an unspoken expectation that if you're a contractor, you are more independent, you are more of a consultant in a way, and therefore the organization expects you to work really hard and do your hours and perform and deliver work. With a permanent employee, of course, you still have to perform very, very well, and depending on your goals and objectives, and depending on where you personally want to go, you may be under exactly the same amount of stress as somebody in a contract role. But in both cases, I think stress here needs to be considered from a mindset perspective. Are you going to put yourself under more stress because you think you should perform better if you're a contractor, or work harder, or whatever it might be? And from a mindset perspective, you might feel less stressed if you had a permanent role. It's really a very subjective consideration, and a very personal one. And I think the most important thing here is to question whether stress, and whatever meaning you give stress, in the context of contracting or in permanent employment, is it valid? And if it's valid, yes, sure, use that to help you make a decision. But if it's not valid, perhaps just recognize that it's not valid and don't let it affect your decision too much. Hope that makes sense. Now, the last consideration is experience. And this is simply saying here, and this is a very valid consideration for everyone. If you've just started out as a business analyst and you haven't got a lot of experience yet, you may find it more difficult to get contracts depending on the market that you're working in. So I always recommend to people, try and get your first role, ideally as a permanent employee. Settle yourself into a role and try and get as much experience on different projects within the organization to kind of set that foundation before you go out and start doing contracting on your own. Just because you want to make yourself as marketable and build your resume to be as strong as possible before you take that leap and say, okay, every 6 months or every 12 months, I'll be moving to a new role. So just think that through and consider whether you feel confident enough in your experience to take the leap into contracting, if that's what you're looking for. Okay, so now what is the verdict? So which one, contracting or permanent roles, would be for you? Now, I've asked you to look at beyond the salary. I've also asked you to really have a bit of introspection, look at who you really are and get to know what you value, get to really understand yourself very well, and question those things that may be false beliefs or limiting beliefs before making those beliefs dictate your decision. Then I also said that experience is important. Stress may be something to consider also from a potentially an invalid or a mindset consideration that you could potentially change. And that, of course, career growth and flexibility. Now, which one will work best for you? Both, or if you go and do the sums from a financial perspective, would actually cancel itself out fairly well. So it's not necessarily that you'll be earning more money if you go onto a contract. Depending on all these factors, all these considerations, all these different costs, depending how much time you take off, all these types of things, and your personal circumstances at home, you may get a bit more money, but you will be sacrificing other things, potentially time. So permanent employment is also great because when I've worked as a permanent employee, it was always good because you felt part of a team and you were in there with a mindset of being there for a longer period of time. There was more of a sense of, I suppose, ownership and being part of a particular group. However, with contracting, I personally have had a lot of experience as a contractor. And like I mentioned before, I value independence and freedom. So even if it's just the mindset, that's where my mind goes. And I love working as a contractor because I love being able to come and go. But then I do have a solid set of experience. I've done the hard yards. So it's up to you in the end. It's really about considering what works for you and considering all these different parts of your life before jumping in and making a decision. But we are lucky as business analysts. There's a lot of demand. So potentially you can try both and see what works best for you. Okay, guys, so I hope you found this useful and that it's given you something to think about. And I hope you've really enjoyed doing this video. If you did, thank you so much and consider subscribing and liking this video. Great, until the next time.